Hello and welcome to Policing TV in this edition of Talking Crime with me, Danny Shaw, and I'm delighted to say that today I'm joined by Abimbola Johnson, who's the chair of the independent board which is overseeing and scrutinising the Police Race Action Plan, which was published by the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing. It's really the plan that is driving forward improvements in the way that the police service deals with issues of race and discrimination. So, Abby, thank you very much for joining us on Policing TV.
Thanks for having me.
I think a lot of people will be interested to know about you, about yourself. You're a barrister, a lawyer, but you've got this very important role in policing.
Yeah.
What led you to forge a career in the law?
So in many ways, I'm just kind of your classic traditional trajectory in terms of how I ended up being a barrister. Pretty much every adult in my family has a law degree, even if they don't practice in law. So my grandfather on my mother's side was actually called to the bar at Middle Temple. And my grandfather-in-law, through my husband, was a judge and was called to the bar at Inner Temple. So I'm very kind of traditional background in that sort of way. My personality was I was always the really precocious kid that would have a reasoned argument for everything, that asked why and really wanted to understand why anyone was asking me to do something. If I saw something that I thought was unfair, I would interject, no matter who the person was that I was dealing with, and so on. So I always had that sort of fire within me. I loved reading. I enjoyed structured debate. I liked looking at different sides of discussions before forming my own view. So a lot of my personality traits spoke to being a lawyer. And you know what they say, you are what you see. Because everyone in my family was a lawyer, they would see the lawyer within me as well. And there's the saying that if you're Nigerian, there are 4 options. You could be a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, or a disappointment. So I had one of the 4 options growing up. But luckily I did want to be a lawyer. And I chose criminal law in particular, actually quite late on in my journey. Late on, I say. I wanted to be a lawyer from growing up. I wanted to be some sort of an advocate. Originally, I would say I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. I didn't really know what that means. No one really knows what that means until you get into the law. But the first time I did work experience with a woman called Anuja Deer, who is now a very well-regarded judge, we went to the Bailey and I watched her in action and I fell in love with criminal law, and I've never really looked back since then.
That's fantastic. But you had some setbacks, didn't you, early on in your career? I think you were denied pupillage.
Oh yeah, the sorest point. Thank you very much for asking me about that, Danny. Bringing that up today. So I had a really smooth journey. I went to private school. I was privately educated from the age of 6. I got straight A's. I went to Oxford. I took a year out to work as a paralegal. I got a scholarship from the Inner Temple, and I was very lucky to get 4 offers of pupillage the first time I applied. So often people have to apply multiple times, or if you do, you rarely get multiple offers. So I had this very, very smooth journey. And I went to a really good set of chambers to do my first pupillage, QEB Hollis Whiteman. Was trained very well there, but unfortunately I was the only person in my cohort who wasn't offered tenancy. So there were 4 of us, and the other 3 who I'm still friends with, they got tenancy and they very much deserved it, but I didn't.
Why didn't you? Did you ask for feedback on it?
If I'm being honest with myself, I did ask for feedback at the time. I got very kind of just kind of generalistic feedback. It was a different time then. I think nowadays people are more willing to give substantive feedback. I think in those times, like we're talking about 10, 11 years ago, it was a bit more of a skim kind of approach. But if I look back at it, and if I'm really honest with myself, I think that I was relatively young. I was straight out of school, basically going into pupillage. I hadn't had, apart from working as a paralegal for a few months during that year between uni and bar school, I hadn't had a set job where you do things day to day, you have that responsibility. So I think I was a little less organised than I could have been. I think sometimes my work was a little bit inconsistent, and I think also I hadn't had any real setbacks in my career, so I don't think I really had appreciated just how much I needed to work and put forward and network and so on. And I had a different attitude when I went to do my pupillage at 25 Bedford Row, which is where I am now. So I did what we call a third six at the bar, so further training on my feet with a supervisor, and luckily got tenancy there, and that's where I've been ever since.
Perhaps you need a setback. Everyone needs a setback,
Exactly.
perhaps, to just really drive them on.
Yeah.
So here you are as a barrister. Barrister of a number of years experience, and we're going to come on to your role overseeing the police race action plan in a minute, but were there some experiences that you have had in the courts, in the law, that you think have sort of led you to the place where you've got this overseeing role over the police?
Yeah, definitely. So for a start, I only do criminal defence, and that was a conscious decision. So when I had that moment of needing to recalibrate and think about the direction I wanted my career to go in after being rejected at QEB, I had to consciously think about the chambers I wanted to be at, what I thought I could contribute to those chambers, and what I thought I could learn from those chambers as well. And the reason I went to 25 was I had already interviewed there during my first round of applications, and I'd been successful on that occasion. So they were always at the top of my list in terms of somewhere I wanted to be. I liked the fact that we concentrate on defence at 25, which means that we use our voices to stand up for the little guy against the weight of the state. And obviously there's nothing wrong with prosecuting. A fair prosecutor can completely change the character of any trial. But I've always been drawn to lending my voice to people against power in that sort of way. And sometimes as a criminal defence barrister, that can just mean giving them the support that they need to enter a guilty plea. It doesn't necessarily mean going all the way to trial. So I was drawn to it in that respect. And what you then learn when you work as a barrister is that you're part of a system. And even if you're working on the defence side, there's only so much that you can do. The people who you are defending, you see them at the worst points of their lives. Mistakes, issues, decisions, all of that has already been done. So even if you get them a good result, the mess has been created. The impact of having been on prolonged periods of police bail or being remanded in custody, that's already happened. They've already had to declare to work or had their education disrupted by the criminal proceedings that they have faced, or they end up in prison. And I was seeing a lot of my clients were young black men who were accused of very often quite minor matters that thoroughly disrupted their lives. I just thought, this is a system that is not changing people's circumstances. It's not dealing with the causes of criminality. It's not challenging the way that we look at criminality. I want to do more. I want to do something that works on making the system itself fairer. And even if I do my job as a barrister to the best of my ability, that role is not actually about reforming the system. So yeah, that's the sort of headspace that I was in when I saw the advert for the ISOB chair.
Was there any particular moment when those views or thoughts crystallised for you?
Yeah, I think that I've always had that aspect kind of running through the things that I have done, which is why even when I was a very junior barrister, I would still get involved in what always diversity and inclusion projects and so on. But obviously diversity and inclusion is not the same as an anti-racism project. Sometimes it's just about adjusting things. It's not about actually challenging the processes or the systems that we work in. So I think a turning point for me was the lead up to 2020. A lot of people say that it was the murder of George Floyd that was their kind of transforming moment. I would say that for me that was the kind of the bomb, but the fuse had already been lit prior to that, leading up to that. Because, particularly as a black woman, George Floyd was the end of, or one of, a stream of cases like that. I went through this period of finding it harder and harder to get out of bed and go to work.
So before this or
before
after?
George Floyd?
Before that.
Yeah, because I just remember this point where it felt like every week there was another story that hit the headlines around an unarmed black man, child, woman being abused, being shot, being maimed, being hurt in some way by people who are supposed to look after them. And then what would happen is I would then go to court and I would look around the courtroom and I would be the only other black face in the courtroom apart from my defendant or apart from the victim's family and the victim. So I was seeing aspects in my role as a criminal defence barrister that were triggering the headlines, had crossover with the headlines that were so emotionally triggering for me. And it became really disheartening. It became depressing, really depressing, if I'm being completely honest. But what kept me going at that time was the pressure to keep going to work. You didn't really have any breathing space. You do one case, you go to the other, you go to the other. Then lockdown came, and all of a sudden the world slowed down. We had more time to think about what we were doing, about why we were doing things, and the news of George Floyd hit the headlines. And the difference this time was that headlines didn't change. So before we had Tamir Rice, before we had Sandra Bland, and so on, and Eric Garner, they would hit the headlines, and then a few weeks later something else would come along, or a few days later something else would come along. The difference with the murder of George Floyd was that news didn't go away. That stayed in the headlines. So I was in this period of lockdown where there was nothing to move on to. And I was in this period of lockdown where it wasn't just me discussing this horrific murder or what had happened with my black friends or my black family. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone around me was having this awakening. So I could no longer compartmentalise what was happening. That trauma now permeated across different aspects of my life, and I had been able to compartmentalise it before and I just couldn't anymore. And it was really, really, really difficult. It was really difficult. And the day after George Floyd was murdered was when we in the UK learned about it. I remember waking up, seeing that headline while I was lying in bed and just feeling so heavy, just feeling really unable to just carry on in the way that I had before, of just kind of pinning my pain to one side and getting on with things. And I made myself a promise that day. I wasn't going to do that anymore. I wasn't going to squash my pain, squash the suffering, and just crack on in the way that I had before. I was going to let people know how I was feeling. So I started to open up a lot more with my colleagues in chambers, with friends, acquaintances, and so on, about how I was feeling, about the fact that things needed to change. And it's transformed the way that I live my life, if I'm being completely honest. And I'm not somebody who is a wallflower. I'm not someone who suffers in silence. So you can imagine this was, for me to say that that was a change means that things really ramped up in terms of discussions and pushing for differences in the way that we approach stuff.
And what was the response you had from people when you did open up, when you did start to have these discussions?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if I were to go back, some of the discussions were quite emotional, so I think that I did sort of lash out slightly in those conversations where I was just frustrated. I was like, why haven't you checked in with your colleagues about this? Why don't you guys take this seriously, and so on? There was some pent-up frustration there. But I'm very lucky in terms of the people who are in my social circles. I'd say they're very emotionally intelligent, they are very sympathetic. A lot of them were already feeling the things that I was feeling, even if it wasn't as concentrated. So people responded really positively. Obviously some people were defensive around it, were upset to hear me saying, I don't think that we do enough in these areas. I think we need to push more as a profession. I think that we need to push more in our personal lives. People would say, actually, you're not aware of exactly what everybody does do, but also we agree we can do more. So yes, the overall is I think that people did respond well to it, that they did take it seriously, and a lot of them were wanting to do so in the first place. So
this opportunity came up to head this board, this independent oversight board for this police race action plan, because clearly the police service decided we've got to do something. Did that immediately, you look at that and think, that's the job for me, that's the role for me? Were you tapped on the shoulder, or did you have some doubts about it? What was your general sort of sense?
Yeah, so I had written an article in The Guardian about a discussion that my friends and I had had when one of them, so it's this WhatsApp group where we're all kind of black professionals, very steady lives and quite boring on paper. But one of our number had seen a potential domestic violence incident. She was a black woman, my friend, and what she had witnessed was a potential incident between a black couple. And she had called the police out of concern for the woman in the interaction. And her partner had said, I don't know if that's a good idea. I don't know if you should have done that. What if what you saw wasn't an incident of domestic violence? What if actually calling the police makes the situation worse? You should have told me what was happening. I could have gone over and spoken to them and tried to diffuse the situation. And so she took to our group to say, do you think I was wrong for calling the police? She started to doubt her decision. She could see where her husband was coming from. And her husband, but also her husband was like, am I wrong for thinking it's wrong to call the police if you see something that's potentially criminal? And it just led to this discussion in our group, and it led to an outpouring of discussions around experiences that people had had with the police growing up, why there was this cynicism, the differences between the experiences that the men in the group had compared to the women in the group, the difference that the women had had because it was a domestic violence incident compared to what the men's experiences were. But running through this was an acceptance that there is cynicism and there is a fear of calling the police. And I know I would not have that type of conversation with my white friends. And this wasn't a case of, these are people who have convictions, who've been through the system, who are cynical because they have something to hide. These are predominantly Russell Group, Oxbridge educated, middle class people who are homeowners, who have no immigration issues or anything like that. Nothing about them characteristically which you would think would cause somebody to hesitate to call the police, but for the fact that we were black. And so I wrote in The Guardian about that, and the fact that speaks to something, that we can have such steady lives and still be concerned about calling the police. And as a result of me writing that article, I had a huge amount of backlash against me on social media. I had a lot of police-associated accounts messaging me, telling me that I was anti-police, that I was fear-mongering. I had a Conservative MP tweet and say that I was disingenuous. He's now deleted that tweet. A black Conservative MP saying that I was effectively a race baiter. And it just it gave me an insight in something I knew had already existed, and I just thought it's shocking that just by sharing a genuine experience that my friends had, that we have day to day, that I'm then labelled as the problem. And then in that same WhatsApp group where we'd had that discussion, where I'd written this article about, with their approval, with their acceptance, one of my friends posted the advert for the chair role and said, you should apply to this role because you have the qualities that are needed. You're the type of person who sees a conversation like that and says, people need to know that this is the way that black people feel about the police. He was like, we would want you in the room. And I looked at the ad, I read the ad, and I thought, it does feel like this is describing me in terms of what they're looking for, but I put it to one side because I just thought, this is just more of the same. This is the police saying, let's speak to black people, let's hear what they want to say, let's do endless surveys, let's write another report. And I just thought nothing's going to happen as a result of it. But then somebody else sent it to me and said the same thing and said, this can be different if somebody like you makes sure that doesn't happen. If we don't participate in these types of things, are things going to change? And so on the last day of the deadline, I applied, and that's how I came to come to that position. But, yeah.
Now it's been an interesting process since then, hasn't it?
Yeah,
because that was last summer, autumn, early autumn,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
And now we've finally got the police race action plan published. Some, I don't know, 8-9 months later.
Yeah.
What has that process been like? Because you had to select a board, of which you are the chair, the Oversight board, and you've also had some role in developing the police race action plan.
Yeah.
Has that been a straightforward process or not? How would you characterise it?
What's been really interesting about this is just kind of I thought that it would be relatively straightforward in terms of, the police come up with this. This was announced in June 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. So there's been some time between the announcement and initially my recruitment and then the time for me to recruit the board. But what was clear was that there were some basic things that really needed to be properly thought through. So just the way that I was paid, for example, they hadn't had a situation where you have an independent chair who is not going to be an employee of any particular police service. So they're like, oh, so how do we pay you? I said, well, what do you mean? Like, how has that not been kind of sorted out and thought through and so on? So little things like that hadn't been put in place when I came in, which I think gives some insight into I think there was a willingness and a real kind of intention to have somebody like me brought into the role, but actually the practicalities of it still needed to be worked out. So there's been a lot of that sort of thing. But what I would say is I was very readily welcomed. I think people were quite excited to have that challenge from somebody like me. I think that there were some who were a little bit shocked about my profile, because obviously I've written quite openly and been critical of some of the things that you see in policing and in the criminal justice system. But actually, I think that's a positive, that they knew that about me and they've put me in place. It shows that they wanted somebody who wouldn't just be a yes woman, they wanted somebody who was really going to push them in those regards. And that is what has happened. So
they've reacted well. When you've pushed them, when you've challenged them on stuff, they haven't just recoiled and gone and say, what on earth were we doing appointing her? That hasn't been the response.
I mean, not in terms of what's come through to me. I don't know if there's probably been a few text messages here and there, but no, not in terms of the way that they've communicated with me. I'd say that it's been really respectful. They obviously, as you've seen with the discussion around institutional racism, which I'm sure we'll come to in a moment, it's not a case of me saying, I think you guys should do this, and then they've done it. But when I have raised things, at least it's been given consideration. When they disagree, they've provided me with reasons as to why they haven't implemented the things in the way that they have. But certainly, I think that we're in a position where the board is going to be properly listened to and engaged with.
The board's taken quite a long time to get together though, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has.
Is there anything to read into that at all or not?
No, so the board has taken some time to get together, but whether the board had got together earlier or not, the action plan only would have been released at this point. And the point is that my board is there to scrutinise the plan. So I don't think there's anything that needs to concern people about the amount of time. One of the reasons it took time was because I wanted to make sure that we had a good period of time with the advert being open for people to apply. I wanted to host a webinar, which you can still watch back on YouTube, where I spoke with Dave and with Andy about their commitment to the board and their commitment to the programme. I wanted to make sure that I could work with a partner agency, like I did Inclusive Boards, who would assist people with the process. So they did interview preparation, they went through people's CVs and cover letters and so on. They explained to them what I was looking for, allowed them to go back and forth so that they were up to speed by the time they got to interview. And I wanted a really robust interview panel as well. So I had Leslie Thomas QC, I had Stuart Lawrence, who's the younger brother of the late Stephen Lawrence, I had Andy George from the MBPA, and I had Hector McCoy, who is one of the workstream coordinators in the plan, assisting me with recruitment. So it was a really thorough process, but vetting did take a really long time. We had to vet everybody prior to confirmation. So people were actually told at the end of February that they had got onto the board. And so a major reason for the delay afterwards was the amount of time it took people to get through vetting. But unfortunately, that's just the process that occurred.
That's the way it is.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the Police Race Action Plan, it's not your plan, it's the NPCC and College of Policing plan.
Yeah.
But how much input did you have into the findings and recommendations and the wording?
Yeah, so there was an iteration of the plan which was circulated to the programme board, which I sit on in a kind of observational capacity, and that was a product that wasn't of the quality that would have been needed for it to go to public survey. And my view is that the value of the plan will be how it responds to public survey, consultation and feedback. And in order to do that, to get good quality feedback from the public, you need to show them a product that shows considered effort, has gone into looking at the reforms and the changes that can be made. And a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, the document that was placed before me, I didn't think was of the quality that ought to go to the public. I think
you made that clear?
And I made that clear. And interestingly, what we did was, with all of our shortlisted candidates, one exercise that we did was that we provided them with that document and said to them, what are your thoughts about this? Asked them questions around it, because obviously that's the purpose of the board, is to scrutinise it. And what I then did was I prepared a report where I summarised all of the feedback that had come through the interview process from all of the 17 shortlisted candidates, feedback that had come through from people like Leslie and Stuart, who had sat on the interview panels with me, and my own feedback from reading through it. And I said, look, these are 17 fantastic individuals who have amazing standing in the community, who are willing to engage, and they all came up with these very poignant, very reasonable criticisms of this document. Now that you have that, you should change the plan, at least tweak it in this way, and they did. Then there was a change in programme leadership. Amanda Pearson went back into the Met, and Tyrone Joyce stepped into leadership role. He looked again at the feedback that I'd provided and the newer, updated version, and thought there's still more that we can do. And he wanted to get it to a certain point. You know, he's one of the most senior black officers in the police service, full stop. His face is going to be on this programme. He wanted to make sure that it was a product that he felt he could back when he takes it out to the public and so on. So it was tweaked again. And that's the document that you now see. And
how sort of satisfied are you as it is at the moment, given that it's going to go out to consultation? Yeah. But do you think this is in a pretty good position? I think
that it is survey worthy, and you know, I think that it's got to a stage now where people who want to engage with this can see the direction that police want to go in. But there's definitely areas that I think can be clarified. I think that there could be clearer targets which are set within it, deadlines. You know, we have questions as a board around resourcing, prioritisation, the practicalities of some of the actions, you know, the success measures and so on. But what we have said as a board is that our power, or our remit, really, it comes from the public forum that we're going to be establishing over the next few weeks, which is going to be free to join for anyone who has any interest in looking at the scrutiny of this. But you know, even in the exercise that I did with speaking to the 17 candidates, that really helped me to clarify and demonstrate to the programme board why those changes needed to be made. And what we don't want as a 6-member board is to become racial gatekeepers for the plan, to suddenly speak on behalf of every black person across England and Wales. We want to make sure that we are constantly going back, constantly checking with, especially those organisations and those individuals who've done this work for many, many years, making sure that we are getting our information from them, understanding from them what their views are, looking at the work that they have done, how that feeds in, and then using our expertise from our various areas of work to really enunciate what people are saying to us and put that before the programme board. So we're actually not going to officially say anything about the content of the action plan until we've had at least a couple of meetings with the forum.
There is one thing I do want to ask you about though, and that's in the forward to the document, because it fudges the issue of institutional racism. So going back a bit, to the police summit, I think in November
Yeah.
last year, I think I'm right in saying you made it pretty clear that this was a red line for you, that police forces had to acknowledge that they were institutionally racist. I think you hinted that you would sort of walk away from the process if they didn't do that. Now I'm giving the opportunity to clarify what you said then, because the forward to the document says, many people believe policing to still be institutionally racist and have grounds for this view. We accept policing still contains racism, discrimination and bias. But that's not an acknowledgement that, in the view of Chief Constables, that policing is institutionally racist. So what was your view back in November, and why have you sort of accepted what it is at the moment?
Yeah, so my view back in November was always, and still is, that the plan needs to tackle institutional racism. And then if the plan doesn't tackle institutional racism, I will say so. I will say that it's not meeting the challenge that it needs to meet. And that remains my view. I think what's been interesting is that people have interpreted that as me saying each and every Chief Constable needs to accept that their particular force is institutionally racist, or that there needs to be this unequivocal acceptance by the police that they are institutionally racist. I am a barrister, so I am an advocate, which means I know to lead with my best point, but it also means that I'm a rational and reasonable person. I know that policing will always find it difficult to accept institutional racism unless something radically changes. By the time I was in position in August 2021, they'd already had since June 2020 to sort out their position around institutional racism. So it was quite clear, even at that stage, that we were never going to get to a point by the time the plan was released of every Chief Constable or so on saying, yes, I accept that there is institutional racism in policing. What I'd say is this: it's not down to police to determine whether or not they are institutionally racist. They were found to be. There was a challenge which was set to the police. There were 70 recommendations which were set out in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry report. There have been a plethora of reports before and after that which demonstrate quite aptly those issues around racial disparity and racism in policing. And policing has never got it right. Policing has never been able to say, here is the evidence that we can demonstrate that we no longer have those issues. In fact, what policing has done is it said, hey, we need to get together and we need to create a national plan to deal with racism because we're not getting it right. And we need to introduce a board that's going to scrutinise our processes because we can't mark our own homework. So I think even the fact that this plan exists has to be an acknowledgement that there is an institutional level of problems with racism in the police.
Even though it doesn't say it explicitly.
And it's a shame that it doesn't. And I'm not going to shy away from that. I think it's a shame that it doesn't. I'm never going to curtail my view and my perspective around that. It's not a personal view that I've come to based on anecdotal evidence. It's a view that is formed by reviewing the very well-researched reports which have gone into policing that demonstrate that. So it would be doing people a disservice, the communities that I am set to champion through my scrutiny role. It would be doing them a disservice if I were to say anything other than the police are institutionally racist, and any action plan that deals with racism must tackle institutional racism. The fact that the police are reluctant to unequivocally accept that is a real shame, and I think also it demonstrates why, for example, it's really, really important that police officers are taught about the history of policing in a clear and proper way, which is one of the actions in the plan, because if you read just chapter 3 of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry report, which deals with racism in policing, it quells all of the arguments around the idea that you are labelling every single cop a racist if you accept institutional racism. If you just read the definition, which thankfully is in that introduction, it says it's about unwitting prejudice, that it's about systems, it's about processes. I don't see how anybody who goes through that definition line by line could disagree that those issues remain in policing. And it's a real shame that these discussions around institutional racism stop at that emotive reaction that people have to the phrase and don't get into the actual meaning of it and the ways that that can be targeted instead.
So you didn't step away.
I didn't step away. I'm still.
Did you ever think about it?
No.
And why do you think it is that there has been this sort of controversy and row with some chief constables accepting it, others not? Police and Crime Commissioner says she thinks her force, the force that she oversees, is institutionally racist. The chief constable is forced to come out and say, I disagree, make statements. What is it about that phrase?
Yeah, I think what it is that emotional reaction to the phrase. I think that there is a fear that by accepting institutional racism, you are seen as labelling the rank and file, every single individual in police as actively racist. And that's not what the definition of institutional racism says. It says... Is that really what it's... why some senior officers won't accept it? Or is it because they actually look at their force and they think, well, I don't think we have an institutional racism issue in our force. We have some officers who might be racist, who might discriminate, but I don't think our processes are like that. Perhaps some chiefs actually hold to that view, not for every force, but some will say about their force, I think our processes are fair and just and we do the best we can. We treat black officers and Asian officers the same as we do white officers. Perhaps some hold that view. That's not that. So what you've just described, it's quite interesting what you've just described. We treat black officers and white officers the same without any discrimination and so on. That's not what the definition of institutional racism goes to. It goes to the fact that even if you were to follow the rules exactly as they are set out, you can still create racial disparity, you can still replicate racism because the rules themselves need to be looked at and need to be challenged.
Do you think then some chief constables don't really understand the definition of what it really means?
I think what would need to happen is each of those chief constables would need to explain what they mean when they say that they do or they don't accept institutional racism. I would love to hear the nuanced explanations that people give, but what I have seen in terms of, and I can't speak on behalf of anybody else, but what I definitely have seen in terms of a lot of the very quick reactions that you have to it is that aspect of, well, we're not all racist, and I don't want to do this because I worry that by doing this I'm isolating people. I'm yet really to have a conversation with anybody where when you go through the actual definition line by line, they disagree with the definition. It seems to be that there is a concern around the optics of how it may come across. And that's why I think the educational piece in the plan is really key, to take the sting out of the terminology and to get people to a point where, rather than having that kind of very reactive discussion around racism, you have a substantive discussion instead.
Now, I know you said that you're sort of, as a board, you're not going to pass judgment on the report, the recommendations in it. You want to see what the reaction is in the consultation, but there's just a couple of points I wanted to ask you about. One of which has been picked up by a lot of the media, which is a mandatory programme of Black history training for police officers.
Yeah.
I think some of the right-wing commentators, let's say, some commentators have sort of, raised an eyebrow at that idea. Why is that important? Is that a proposal that you support, and if so, why do you think it's important?
I think that learning about history is really important, and I think that the way that history is taught is often, it's taught from the position of the winner. You get a potentially skewed perspective when you learn history in that way. So I think it would be a wonderful thing to see a course being created where the history of policing and Black communities is critically analysed, where what is centred are the Black experiences, where officers go through that and they are able to really empathise and understand the generational trauma that a lot of people have with their interactions with a police officer. When they see the badge, when they see the uniform, it's not a sense of comfort that they feel, but actually that they're quite concerned or wary of like having those interactions with police officers, so they can understand that and therefore have that emotional intelligence to cut through that and to de-escalate situations and to relate to people on a one-to-one human basis. I think that's a fantastic thing to have in there. The questions that I would have around that, and the sort of things that I would be asking of people in the forum, is who do you want to see developing those courses? What sort of content do you think needs to be included in those courses? And how do you want those courses to be monitored? You know, how should they be graded? How often should an officer go back to it? What sort of resource do you want to see from it? Do you want to see it done via the college, or would you rather it's an independent establishment? Those are the sorts of questions that we would ask around that.
One of the other key issues is the recruitment of black officers into the police service. The figures are pretty shocking. Less than 1,600 officers in England and Wales are black. It's 1.3%. The population is 3.5%, and that I think is based on a census which is about 10 years out of date. And it's hardly shifted since 2010. So there are a number of ideas in the plan. Looking at it from my point of view, it doesn't seem like those ideas are particularly radical or different from what's been tried before.
Yeah.
You're nodding in agreement. Would you agree then with Neil Basu, Assistant Commissioner of the Met, the Police Foundation report on policing, and Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, the former Metropolitan Police Commissioner, among others, who say we need positive discrimination, at least for a limited period of time, to give priority to ethnic minority candidates over white candidates?
Okay, so I always find this such an interesting conversation, because I guess my response to that is, what do you think that having a more representative police force will do? What is the aim? And that's what needs to be considered. What are you aiming for by doing that? And I think there is a danger of thinking that just aiming to have a representative police force in terms of numbers will change the culture of policing. When you break that down, there's a risk that what you're saying is you're going to recruit black officers so that they can take it upon themselves to change the culture of policing. What needs to be different is that not only do you need to look at recruitment, you also need to look at the culture that you are bringing those officers into. It can't be enough to expect black people to transform the culture of an organisation where we will always be in the minority. Even if you had a representative police force, say that we doubled the census statistics, because we still haven't seen the census statistics from last year. So like you say, that 3.3 figure comes from the 2011 census, and I imagine that we're more diverse now than before. So even if you were to double that, if you had a police force that had 6.6% black people in it, is that a critical enough mass to change the culture of all of policing? It probably wouldn't be. So the question would be, what is proactively going to be done to change the canteen culture? What is going to be done to ensure that we don't see another Operation Hutton? What is going to be done to ensure that that culture, the WhatsApp groups, the banter, the overuse of disciplinary measures against black officers and so on, the lack of retention, the lack of promotion, is also cut at the knees. Those are the aspects that would make this different. It's not enough just to bring back people through the door. You need to be bringing them into a safe environment.
I'm sure people won't disagree with you.
Yeah.
That's one thing, but it is still an important thing.
Of course, yeah.
Particularly at senior levels in the police service, which are very, very underrepresented.
Yeah, and not just
by
at senior levels, but where in senior levels
and in specialist departments and
Yeah.
so on. But do you think that as one part of it, a positive discrimination programme is the way? Because it seems that black people just don't really want to join the police in sufficient numbers at the moment.
I think that the police have already their public sector equality duty on them. They already have legislation that allows them to use affirmative action. So my question would be, why is the route that's already available in terms of affirmative action, why is that so underused? What are the issues there? Would they actually use positive discrimination if the law were changed to allow for positive discrimination to be legal in this particular area? So I think there's a number of questions to be asked prior to that. I can't say either way, if I'm being completely frank, whether I would support positive discrimination. What I would say is I would support something that increased the numbers of black officers if you're simultaneously changing the culture in policing. That's my answer to that. So I know it's not a simple yes or no, but yeah, I would support anything that would make the police more representative whilst also ensuring it's a safer environment and culture and more respected environment and culture that they would be coming into.
Abby Johnson, thank you very much for joining us on Policing TV. Thank you.
Thank you.